Welcome, everyone. I have been doing research for 50 years now, which is kind of mind-boggling. Started the hard way with microfilms and trips to libraries, and am so grateful for the technology that we have today to help us with our research. So in this presentation, I'm going to be sharing some of my own personal tips and tricks that have helped me to break down some brick walls and to expand the family lines on our tree. So let's get started. My first suggestion is simply to write down what you already know about the individual or family that you are researching. Set some goals. It helps me to actually write out a timeline and see what I'm missing. I like to check things off when I find what I'm looking for and keep track of what I've looked at. So in this class, for an example, I'll be using a relative of mine. His name's Urban Patillo. He's my great-grandfather's uncle. And we have a little bit of information about his family, but there were some holes. So in writing things down and setting goals, Family Search is aware this is important and might be helpful. And it might be helpful to make a to-do list. So they've provided a ready-made template for a to-do list on your homepage when you sign in on Family Search. So you can write down little things and come back to them later and check them off when you have completed them. I like this little quote by Steve Maraboli. He said, if you have a goal, write it down. If you do not write it down, you do not have a goal, you have a wish. I have found that just writing things down really helps me to visualize what I'm working on, whether you write it on a computer document or on a notebook. Writing it down really can help. We also can keep a research log so that we're really keeping good track of the records that we've looked at and what information we've gleaned from those records, or if we didn't find anything, make a note of it. You'd be surprised how much time is wasted going over the same records that you've already looked at and didn't make a note of it previously. So a research log is a great tool. So in looking at my uncle's or great-great-uncle's family, I set some goals. I saw on Family Tree that he was listed as having two wives, a Carolyn Curitan and an Elizabeth Carolyn Grier. And the fourth child that you see, Samuel David Patillo, was listed as a son of both women. So I even wondered, is there really two wives? Because I could not find a marriage record for a second wife, and we couldn't verify the year of death for a first wife. So I wanted to determine, were there really two, and try and solve that. I also had quite a few children, but most of them were missing death records or spouses and family. So I wanted to fill in the holes there. So I made a little list of what I wanted to learn and then started my project. I find as a consultant that the majority of the individuals that have asked for help are kind of stuck on looking at Family Search or Ancestry and what record hints are available. And they don't go any further. They don't try a variety of different websites that might have information or books or other possibilities. So my second tip is don't limit yourself. Don't put on those blinders. Be open to all of the different types of records that are available. You can use things such as Cindy's List and the Family Search Wiki to help you find different websites or libraries or archives that might help you with the information that you're looking for. So don't get stuck on just your two favorite sites. Learn how to do research on other web pages. My next tip is, because every website is a little bit different from the others, you need to take a minute to learn how to use it. You find out if they have filters that you can use and learn the best way to use those tools that are available. So this is an example from Ancestry.com where I was looking for a relative, Hannah Janet Buck. And we had some good information about her. And if you do a search with the basic information, it's pretty broad in this result. So you can see I had over 177,000 results, which was a little bit too much. So I wanted to use the filters that Ancestry provides to narrow my search down. Just be careful not to filter out all of the different options. Notice that you can also narrow your search by the filters down below for the different types of records. Maybe I'm just really focused on looking for a marriage record. I could narrow things right down to that. If I put in that I want only records that have her exact year of birth, it brings down the results dramatically, but I might also miss a few things. I might miss records such as a census record that would just give her age and might be off a year or two. So play around with the filters a little bit and see what it does to the results. Also, like I said, you can filter by the type of collection. So in this case, I just filtered by birth, marriage, and death records, and then I didn't worry about all those others. Knowing that my Hannah lived only in the United States, I could also filter out the location and take out any from Europe because she never lived there, and that will help me find more accurate records for her. So what would happen if I said, well, I know what year she was born and what year she died, and I want an exact name, and I asked Ancestry for an exact search with all of the data that I knew? I would get no results at all because there just aren't any records that have all of that information on it with the exact data. So play around with the records and see what results you get in your filters. Family Search also has some great filters. Once you do a basic search, you can again search by collection, or you can change things such as a time frame or a type of record that you're specifically looking for. So if I filtered out all of those that were for a Hannah that lived in Europe, I can edit for the residents and choose only the United States, and then even narrow it down to the state of Massachusetts where she lived, and just look at those records. If you choose the Collections tab, it will filter and sort all of the results into collections over on the right, and then you can choose which ones you want to view. Now, I've only shown you a little bit from Ancestry and Family Search, but the other websites all work a little bit different, and you need to take a minute to learn how they function. If you're looking at a state archive page, look and see how it works. Do they have helps available online that can teach you how to use their website? My next tip is don't get stuck with the spelling of a name. There are too many records where a name might be written different or transcribed wrong. Maybe your individual's going by a nickname, or maybe the record is showing a middle name or just initials. There are so many different ways that a person's name might be written. Don't get stuck thinking it needs to be a specific way or it's wrong. So these are a lot of different spellings that I found on Ancestry for one individual named Littleton Patillo. And even Urban Patillo, you can see how his name was transcribed or written different in a variety of ways. Several years ago, when I was researching my husband's Danish family, he has a relative named Kirsten Jorgensdottir, who was the first in her family to join the church in Denmark. She came to Utah in the late 1850s and married Niels Peter Madsen. She was his second wife. He was already married, so it's a polygamous relationship. And I started looking for records for them in Utah. Well, I was happy because I found the 1860 census, 1870, and 1880 census with Niels and both of his wives in the household. Their names were not spelled the way that I expected, though. Niels Madsen's surname on all of the records is spelled a little bit different. But I knew it was the right person based on even the different spellings of the wives' names. So I attached these sources, and I had a relative contact me and say, why did you attach that? You know, that's not the right person. That's not how they spelled the name. And I had to explain to them that it was a phonetic version of the name. And if you looked at all the data, it really is the people that we were looking for. So don't get stuck with name problems. Sometimes guessing a name variation can be a challenge. And on the Family Search Wiki, there are some great pages that can help us with that. This one is titled Guessing a Name Variation, and you can see from the contents that there are a lot of different ways that they provide help for in finding names. For example, maybe just do a surname only search, look for abbreviations, look for that person's middle name, and you can see all the different ways that they have shown just the name James William Green, and Green itself could be spelled a variety of different ways. Also connected with this page on the Family Search Wiki is a great list called the Phonetic Substitutes List. So we know that from many of the early records, the census records and more, that the names were written phonetically. The person just wrote down what they heard. Maybe they heard something and wrote down what you wouldn't expect. So this little list gives you some suggestions for different substitutions for an original sound that they might have heard. And the list goes on all through the alphabet. The Wiki page also includes things like commonly misread letters. So you know how sometimes those names are transcribed wrong? This list can help you actually see what a letter might have been incorrectly transcribed as, just because of the way the handwriting was. So these I have found very, very helpful. Also, on the Family Search Wiki is a list of traditional nicknames. So if you ever seen a nickname and not really sure what the original name might have been, this is a great list. Lots and lots of names. You just look at them in alphabetical order. And just remember, these are traditional nicknames. So you might have someone that doesn't have a traditional nickname, or their nickname isn't really representing the word that's there, but it's a good place to start. Be flexible in looking at the names of your relatives. We all have immigrant ancestors, and very often our immigrant relatives changed their names. So this is my great-grandpa, Ferdinand Lawrence Jorgensen. He was born in Denmark. This kind of fuzzy record at the bottom is his christening record. And so you can see that's the name he was given, his official name. He was 9 years old when the family immigrated, and there are no records at all for him with that Jorgensen surname. The family changed the name to Johnson, and all of the records that I found show him as Lars F. Johnson. So be aware of that. Another example of a family that had their names changed when they immigrated. This is a little family from Denmark, and you can see that Jens Wilhelm Jensen and Rasmina Rasmussen. I started out with just a couple of children and another son with the name Alfred Johnson. And Alfred, I wondered why Johnson, was that wrong? But I discovered that the death dates for the parents were in the United States. It was not hard to find their immigration records, but finding them in the 1900 census was a real challenge. And it was not until I looked for the son in the census that I was able to find the whole family. And you can see how the names are all a little bit varied. Okay, I'm going to answer a question that was asked about the Family Search Wiki. I'm going to tell a little bit more about the wiki in a minute, but it's found on the Family Search website under the Search tab, and you can see it'll say Research Wiki. So it's pretty easy to find. I won't go into a lot of details about how to use it, but they do have some helps on the Family Search Wiki website for how to use it. So thanks for your question. I hope that helped. We'll talk a little bit more about the wiki in a second. Another help with names, you probably have noticed that if you're doing a search on Ancestry or Family Search, it will also find names with a similar spelling, but not all websites do. So try to find out if the site you're using requires that exact spelling. So for example, if I'm looking for a family in the newspaper, I know I either need to use an exact spelling or I need to see if that newspaper site allows wildcards. And we'll talk about those in a second too. Find a Grave is a website that used to require only an exact spelling search. So I would have to try a variety of spellings for an individual. But when Ancestry purchased Find a Grave, they added some new ways to improve your search. So this is just an example of doing a search for a George Patillo with no other data. And it came up with 47 matches on Find a Grave, which is pretty good. But when I went to the filters, you can see if you look below the search fields, you'll see a lot of filters. And they have one now that says similar name spellings. You have to check that box if you want it to look for similar spellings. So I checked that box and you can see it almost doubled my results for George Patillo because it would look for similar names, not just that exact name. And there are some other websites that you have to be careful because it will only use an exact spelling. So again, find out how the website functions that you are using. Another tip on names is if you are researching a female relative, if you know both her maiden name and her married name, try separate searches with both of those names. Now, I know sometimes you don't know her maiden name, and so that causes a problem. In that case, look at all of her other relatives for clues as to what her maiden name might be. And we'll talk a little more about that in a minute too. But if you know both of those names, try a search with both the maiden name and the married name. If you have the data on the person's family tree, Family Search and Ancestry would do a pretty good job of picking up both the maiden name and the married name, but you will still get slightly different results if you put one as a priority. So this is just an example of a search for my great-grandfather's sister. Her name was Ada Virginia Patillo, and she married a man named William Eves. And so I just did a search for her, and you can see it came up with a lot of results, but only this first one is for my Ada. I had to go way down before I, found others. If I changed the search and put in her married name, now I got a lot more results coming to the top with that Eves surname. And you can do the same thing on Family Search, looking for both the maiden name and the married name. So here's a search for Ada. And it did come up with some that have both the married name and the maiden name and some other results. It was pretty good. But when I switch and put the maiden name or the married name as the last name, then those records with that name come up to the top. So even though they might show up in a search, you can bring them up to the top by trading those names. Just be aware that you might need to play with your relative's name in a lot of ways, whether that person used a nickname or their middle name, or sometimes a very different name. For example, my grandchildren's great-great-grandpa came from Greece, and the surname was Dinkos. But after he immigrated, the name changed to Diamond. Dinkos has nothing to do with diamonds, but he used to wear a diamond pin on his suit. And people just started calling him Mr. Diamond, and the name stuck. So sometimes you never know where that little name came from. It can be a search, but it's so rewarding once you get the results. I mentioned wildcards a little bit. Each website may or may not use wildcards, so take a moment to look in their helps and see if you can use wildcards. Some people don't realize that you can use wildcards on Family Search or just using those wildcards on Google and other websites. Find out which wildcards are used for that site and then practice using them. So I know in most cases, a asterisk or the little star will match 0 or more non-space characters, and a question mark will match only 1. So I usually will use the little star. And you can use several in one search. So as it shows in the examples up here. So it's helpful to just kind of play with them. One of the Danish websites that I use frequently allows wildcards, but they're not the wildcards that I'm accustomed to on the other sites. So it's helpful to know which wildcards a site will use and if you can use them. And sometimes putting a name in quotes, for example, will help you get better results as well. Another tip that I use in a search is to add a relationship. So remember, you don't want to start out with too much information all at once, but if you know a spouse's name or a parent's name, try a search adding that relationship and see what happens. So I know my Urban Patillo had a grandson named Urban, and his wife's name was Ethel. So I decided to try a search and see what kind of results I get. So I did a basic search with just Urban Patillo on Family Search, and it came up with over 79,000 results. Well, I know most of those are not for an Urban Patillo at all, because it's going to come up with a lot of people with a similar name. But when I added a spouse and put in the name Ethel, it brought the results down dramatically, and all of those that had Ethel as a spouse came up to the top. And it helped to pinpoint specific records for that specific family. So I did the same thing with my Urban that I was looking for, but I set my goals. And remember, he had a wife named Carolyn Elizabeth and possibly a wife named Elizabeth Carolyn, which is a little confusing. So I just added a spouse with Carolyn Elizabeth, and noticed that in the search results, it came up with a lot of different results, with both Elizabeth as the first name or Carolyn as the first name, and also names with an initial in the center instead of the full name written out. Eventually, I was able to find out that there really were 2 wives because I found an obituary for the first wife. But this helped to sort out which children belonged with which of the women as well. Here's a search that is one of my favorite kind, where I use relationships, and it's searching with only the names of the parents. If you haven't tried this, practice with it. It's a great way to search for family information. So I do a lot of Danish research, but it works well not only for Danish families. But so I'm using a Danish family for this example. I have this couple, Hans Hansen and Maren Henriksdatter. And I wanted to find records for this couple and their children. So on Family Search, in the search field, I left the top part completely blank. I put in the place where the family lived. It's a little island, so I assumed they would probably stay on that island because most families that I've searched on that island stayed there for several generations. So I decided to start with that and put in the place, but left the other data blank. I scrolled down and put in additional family members, and I added the mother's name and the father's name. So my search consisted of just the parents' names down in the additional part and the place where they lived. When I did the search, these are some of the results that I got. I quickly found 29 different record hints that all pertained specifically to this family, and most were not linked already to family's tree. So you can tell if they're linked because there would be a little pedigree icon here. But if you look carefully, you can see that the parents' names are all the same. The time frame is in the same time period that these people would be having children. Some of them are obviously, from the same record, like the 1860 census here or the 1845, but they're different members of the family. So it helped with my research in putting the little family together. And I also will do a parent name search on the tree. So not just searching for records, But if I'm going to add a new family, I want to see if they're already on the tree somewhere. Or if I'm looking at, in this case, I would see if they're linked to the tree somewhere, because it might provide me with duplicates that need to be merged. So this is a trick that I use a lot and is very helpful. Here's an example of where I did a similar search, where I was looking for records for a George Patillo that had a wife named Lula. And I put Lula in the name field and got even results with a Lois. Well, Lois wasn't the right wife. They lived in a different place. But look at all the different spellings for Lula's surname. This really helped me to find his wife's maiden name. Even though they were spelled different, I got the basic idea and I could find her with her family. So this has been a search that's kind of one of my favorite types of searches because it's so successful. My next tip is to use the fan club method of searching. So you've probably heard of this method before. Fan club stands for family, associates, and neighbors. And what you do, if you're having trouble finding specific records for your individual, look at all the other members of his family. Look at their neighbors. Did they immigrate? Did some of their neighbors immigrate at the same time? Or maybe they just moved from one state to another at the same time, such as your pioneer immigrants or individuals that received land grants and moved together. Look at their associates. Who did they work with? Were they part of an organization? What church did they belong to? All of these might help you to find records for your individual. So look at the cemetery where a relative is buried and see who else is buried in that cemetery. There's a real good chance that there are other family members buried there. If you know the name of the funeral home where your relative or someone in the family was buried, check and see if they have records for other family members, because there's a good chance they did. Was your relative a member of a society such as the Masons or the Oddfellows? Do they have records that they're willing to share with you that might help you with more information? There's an organization called the Danish Brotherhood that's here in the United States for it started for Danish immigrants, and they asked lots of questions and got great information about their families back home in Denmark. What church did your relatives belong to? My sister, who's been working on a project for her husband's family, discovered that there is a book of a German church in Ohio, and she knew that her husband's family immigrated from Germany and settled in what's now Cincinnati, Ohio, looked through that whole book, which was not indexed, and found lots of family members for his family. Did your relative immigrate? Who came with them? All of these things might provide clues to help you find other family members or that elusive clue that you're hunting for to help you fill out your tree. We recently went to Clark Lane in Farmington, Utah. It's actually kind of their main street with a lot of old homes that are still there that were owned by all members of the same family, descendants of Ezra Thompson Clark. So you might look at the neighborhood where your relative lived. Were there other members of a family in the same neighborhood? I know in my own neighborhood, when we first moved in, we discovered that there were 3 different homes on our block that were owned by members of the same Nielsen family. So look and see what was going on in their neighborhood or community as well. This is just a little clip from that book, the church book that my sister found, the St. Martin's Church. It was all written in German. She doesn't read German, but she could certainly find the Wiemeyer family name. And this is just one example of one of the records that she found there. Books can be a great source for information. And just knowing that the family attended that church helped her to find lots of records that she didn't previously have. Whenever I find one family member or more information about them, I look at that source and see if I can find information about other family members. So this is just one example where I was looking at one of the children of Urban Patillo, and her name was Laura Carolyn. She was one of, I think, his youngest child. And I found records for her in Arkansas and Georgia. And I didn't realize that after she married, she had gone to Texas. So I was excited to find her in this Find a Grave record. I looked for other members of the family with her married surname, Rudy, and there were a lot buried in that cemetery. And then I did a little check for the Patillo name in that cemetery, not really expecting a lot of results for that unusual name, but was delighted when I discovered that the only other Patillo buried there is her mother, Urban's second wife. So this is Carrie, who is another Carolyn Elizabeth. And now I had a year of death for her and could hunt for more information to get more exact data. So I was really excited to find that. An obituary might provide you with a lot of other clues. So if you can, look at those images and see what you can glean from it. So here's a little family that I had on Family Tree, Andrew and Ida Lund. And originally we had just 2 children for them. But when I found the obituary for Andrew, it added a middle name for him, specific information about when he died and his birth date included, but also the children. So the obituary mentioned 4 children. So from this, we were able to add more children to the family and search and find more clues that gave us more data about those children. So speaking of looking at the document, that's my next tip. Super important. If you find a hint and there's an image related to it, just take a moment to look at that image and see if it will provide you with more information. Just yesterday, I was looking at some record hints that I got for death certificates in Georgia, and it just had the year of birth and the year of death. So I looked at the image, and of course it had the complete birthday and death date. Don't know why not all of the information was transcribed, but I needed to look at the image to get all the data. This is an example of one of my Patillo relatives. His name's Joseph Wilson Patillo. And I was actually looking for a marriage for him. Knowing that he was born in 1900, I thought I would be able to find a marriage record, and it was a little hard to find one, but I came across this record hint for a death certificate. I know it's him because it gives me a little bit of information about his parents' names, and I know that's the right year of birth. So I wanted to look at the record to see if it could give me more information. This is what I discovered. I learned that he was indeed married. And in fact, this is his wife's name. It's just, that's a funny looking H, but her name was Helen, and she was the informant. He had an unusual occupation. He was a golf pro. So that was fun and interesting to learn. I learned the important information about where he's buried. So he died in Atlanta, Georgia, but he's buried in Panthersville in the Macedonia Cemetery. All of that is great information that can help me. But then I looked at the cause of death, and there's all these words that I didn't know what they mean, so I just used Google to look up some of them. This transverse myelitis, traumatic, has this little note, spinal puncture. What happened is that he had a spinal puncture from a gunshot, and it's listed as a homicide. So I was a little surprised that we had a little murder on our family tree and wanted to find out who shot the young golf pro, right? So I did a little searching in newspapers. Actually, we did a lot of searching. I started where he died in January and could not find an obituary or even a death notice. So I started to spread out my search, and then it dawned on me, now wait a minute. He died in Atlanta, but it says here he was shot in Montgomery, Alabama. Well, you can't get from Montgomery to Alabama in less than 3 hours today. And I imagine it took longer in 1930. So obviously he didn't die immediately. So newspapers came to our rescue and we learned the story about his death, discovered that he was shot by a woman, also named Helen, who was in one article reported as his wife, but she wasn't, had a different surname. She was arrested, but he did not want to press charges. And they said that it was an accident, that they were kind of fighting over the gun when it accidentally went off. But the police and the doctor all said that's impossible. There were no powder burns found on his body, and the angle of the bullet wound, the doctor said that would be impossible. So they initially charged the woman, but Joseph didn't die immediately, and he didn't want to press charges, so she was released. But then when he died, it became a homicide case, and there was a court. Everything started all over again. But it was an interesting story that I would not have discovered if I hadn't looked at that detailed death certificate. Another example is this. Thomas Curitin Patillo is one of the oldest sons, I think the oldest son of Urban Patillo, who I was trying to find out all about his family. I initially did not have a death date for Thomas, and it even had an incorrect middle name. Curitin is his mother's maiden name, so that's where he got that middle name, and that's right. But I was hunting for a marriage or something, and I got this little record hand on Family Search that gives me just a tiny bit of information. It says that Thomas was in the Georgia 7th Infantry during the Civil War. But I have this little link here that invited me to visit the partner site, and that's where I found this document and an additional 48 pages like this with information about his entire history in the war, from the day he enlisted to the battles that he fought in, where they took a muster roll. He was wounded 3 different times. The first 2 times it told me what hospital he was taken at. And then the 3rd time it said he was captured and taken prisoner. And it even told me which prisoner of war camp he was sent to. And I looked up all of these places and things to learn more about him. After he was in that prison camp for a while, he was actually traded. They used to do that early in the war, trade prisoners. So I looked up the landing where he was traded and learned about the history of that event. And then it said that he was on furlough for a while, went home to recover from that whole ordeal before coming back into battle again and joining his group. Well, one of the many 48 pages, and they were not in chronological order, one of them had this little statement, which is enlarged here, and it says that uncarded records show him killed at Petersburg, June 19th, 1864. Well, now I had to look up Petersburg and find out what was going on there. But I now had the date of his death, and this is the only record of his death that I've been able to find. So I was so involved with his history and story because there were so many interesting documents that gave me just little bits, each one, that I put together a book telling his story and gave it to my kids for Christmas that year. I didn't want his story to be forgotten. And even though he was never married, never had any descendants, I felt like his story was important to share. Here's another example. I was researching a relative, Solon Borglum, who was also a Danish immigrant. And among the record hints that came up was his wife's passport application. So it gives me a little bit of indexed information. I know that he met his wife when he went to France to study art. They got married and came back to the US. His brother happened to marry his wife's sister, which was kind of a fun fact. But this is when she applied for a passport to go back, I guess, for a visit. Well, great information, but if I don't look at the image, I will miss out on a lot. On the image, I learned that she's now a widow, and it even gives me the date and place of her husband's death, This document tells me their marriage date and place, and it has their birth information and residencies and more, including places and dates that she had lived outside the US and when. So exciting. I could have ended there, but I went to the next page, and on the next page was her photograph. So when you're looking at documents, see if there's an additional document. I know that the previous class was all about the awesome full text search that's available. Very often there are going to be more than one page connected in one file, whether it's land records, wills, probates, or whatever. Take a look and see if there are more documents connected. Is there another page? And sometimes a passport photo is the only picture you'll be able to get of a relative. So to me, they're pretty exciting. These are a few of the passport photos that I've been able to find. When I find a record hint for Find a Grave, and we'll get them from both Family Search or Ancestry, take a moment to go to the actual page and see what else is on that page. I have found death certificates, biographies, obituaries, other family members, and often the data that is on Find a Grave will add to what I need. Maybe I'm finding that a child has now a spouse linked that I didn't have. Always take a look. It's very worthwhile. I recently found this record on Find a Grave and was delighted to have a photo of this relative, and there's a complete obituary for him as well. So my next tip is to take all the data that you've been collecting and making notes about and think like a detective. Sometimes you just have to stop and look at what you've got and put two and two together. So ask yourself those questions. Who is this document about? What type of document is it? Where was it created and why and when? And gather all of that evidence together and see if it helps you to discover more. In looking for information about Urban Patillo, I found him in 3 different states. In Georgia, the family was found in Rome, Georgia, in the 1880 census, and that's the last record I could find of him until I found this. This is a city directory. And a lot of the time, people kind of don't even bother looking at those, but I like looking at them and see what I can learn. This lists his wife, Carolyn, and it says that she's a widow. So this is the same Carrie that's buried in Texas, where her daughter is. But this city directory is from Tennessee. Well, I had not looked at any records in Tennessee. I didn't know the family had even been there. But it's just over the border from where Rome is in Georgia. So here Carolyn is, now a widow in 1887, and that helped me to narrow down the death of her husband. She's also listed with 2 of her children, and Samuel is at the same address that she's at. You can even take the addresses and go to Google Maps and see if that building is still there. That's a fun thing to do. Well, I did some more searching. It took a while, actually a couple of years, but eventually looking at newspapers on the Georgia Historical Newspaper site, I found a little record mentioning the death of Urban Patillo. So now I had a closer date. It doesn't say the day he died. There's no death certificates for that time period. But this paper was published on the 2nd of April, 1884. So I think it's pretty safe to assume that he died in March of 1884, and that's about as close as we can get. The obituary on the left, or that's not an obituary, it's a marriage record. So I found this before I found his obituary, and it's actually the marriage record of his nephew near Rome, Georgia. So Robert Sidney Patillo had his uncle perform the marriage. So we have discovered several different marriage records that show Urban Patillo with that Reverend in the title. So he had an interesting career. I found some census records for a Mary J. Wise or a Mary Jane Wise in a different census. And I wondered if that was Mary Jane Patillo, the daughter of Urban. I was trying to find a marriage record for a Patillo with a Henry Wise and couldn't find one. So I was a little baffled and kept looking to see what I could find. In searching for all of the children in the family, on fold 3, I found a document for the youngest son, Samuel Patillo, when he applied for a pension. So this was about 20 years after the war, and the government said they could apply for pensions, so he filled out this application. And on it, there's one little paragraph that says, Mrs. M.J. Wise swears as follows, that I'm personally acquainted with S.D. Patillo. He's my brother. And I do know that he served in the Confederate Army, for I visited him while in service as many as 3 times at Atlanta, Georgia, and she gives the date. So this was the proof I needed that Mary Jane Wise was my Mary Jane Patillo. I still haven't found a marriage record for them, but in looking at the census records, I found another puzzle. So here's the 1870 census, and here is the 1900 census. The 1900 census says that they've been married 34 years, which is interesting. Because we've got children, this first son here, Robert, and others from the previous census that were born before those 34 years. So looking at that clue and the other information, such as that she's had 7 children and 6 are now living, I was finally able to determine that Henry had been married before, found that first marriage and the death of his first wife, and could make sure that I had the right children with the right mother. I had another mystery that I needed to kind of think like a detective. This is my great-grandpa, George Fletcher Patillo. And most of my life, my mother searched for a marriage record for his second marriage and a death record of his first wife. And she's not the only one. My aunts and uncles and others were hunting for that same information. This is a marriage record for his first wife, Addie McAllister. And that was in Georgia. But later, he came to Utah because his wife, Ellen Reed Patillo, had come with her family to Utah because they had joined the church in Georgia and were persecuted. And so she just left him and he came following after her. They ended up getting divorced eventually, and this is the record of their divorce. So my family, my mother and her siblings, all thought there was a third marriage because after his marriage divorce to Ellen, he married my great-grandmother, who is Esther Clark, who was a young widow. Well, so they had Addie and Ellen and Esther and hunted and hunted. My mother even made trips to Georgia to look for death records for the first wife. We couldn't find a second marriage, and it was like a big brick wall. Eventually, my uncle was able to get copies of a family Bible, pages from a family Bible that are in Georgia. And in it says that George, G.F. Patillo, married an Addie Reed. I think that's supposed to say Reed. Well, Ellen's maiden name is Reed. And I looked at that and I said to my uncle, I think Addie and Ellen are the same person. And he was like, oh no, there were 3 wives. But I couldn't prove it because we couldn't, there was not a death record. There wasn't a marriage record. I needed to prove that Addie and Ellen were really the same person. I thought this was a pretty good clue. And so I figured with some searching, I'd find something. Well, recently, I found this city directory. So there's 2 actually that helped. This one is 1889, which is the year my great-grandpa left Georgia and came to Utah. But this is the Atlanta directory. And notice that he's working for it's the Eastern Tennessee and Virginia and Georgia railroads. So he was a tinsmith, worked for the railroad. Well, the year before, that's the year he left. So Addie had left him by then, or Ellen Reed. This is what I found for 1888, just the year before. There's my great-grandpa on page 756. On the previous page is Addie, not Helen, it's Addie. And they're at the same address. And she's a tailoress for S.H. Patillo, who happens to be the father of George. This to me was proof enough that Addie and Ellen are really the same person. I mean, even on the divorce record, it said Ellen A. Reed. So it was putting all of these clues together to decide that all of those years of hunting for a death record and a second marriage record were kind of wasted energy because he only had the one wife before this divorce. So I was real happy when I found that. So by now you figured out that I look at everything I possibly can. I don't do it for every single person that I'm adding to the tree, but the families that I'm really researching and want to find answers for might require really digging deep. What kind of records can you find? Maybe it's going to be a tax list or a map that gives you the clues that you need. See what's available and look at all of those possibilities. You might have to actually look at a microfilm. Not everything is digitized and online. You might have to visit a courthouse or a library or a historical society. This is a picture of my mother and my sister when we were visiting the courthouse in Cartersville, Georgia, looking for those elusive records that didn't exist. But notice the big books behind my mother. Lots and lots of books. And this was the old courthouse. The new courthouse had a room full of similar sized books. None of them have been filmed or indexed in any way. We found this page when we were looking for a marriage record that didn't exist. And it's the 1880 record of when my great-grandmother applied for a tax exemption. So my great-grandpa, great-great, I guess, was still alive, but she felt like they shouldn't have to pay taxes because they didn't make very much money. And they had to declare everything they owned. And I have this great list from this book that's only found in the courthouse at Cartersville, Georgia. Did it provide me with big answers to questions? No. But was it really interesting and add to the family history? Yes. So in looking at all of the clues that I found, I put it all together. I was able to check off most of the boxes from my to-do list. I still haven't found that second marriage, but I've found marriages for most of his children, and I've found grandchildren, and I've got death records and more that I didn't previously have. This is a Pazilla diagram showing urban in the center, and these are all of his descendants. I love that. So use the Family Search Wiki. We talked just a little bit about it. It's an amazing resource that has links to pages that can give you detailed information on how to find records or how to read records. So it's an amazing source. Also use the catalogs. Family Search and Ancestry have great catalogs. And the Family Search catalog will link you to records that are not indexed, so might provide more information. You can do searches from a variety of different ways in the catalog. Look at Family Search. Are you using all of these research options, or are you just relying on getting a record hint? Great new things have been added that are available to us. And soon the full text search will be available there. You have to go through the Family Search labs to access it now, but I've found some amazing documents in the full text search, and I love it. If you haven't used it, to be sure and try it. There's a link on the homepage on Family Search once you've signed in to go to the labs, watch the little video about how to improve your searches, and enjoy. It's just a gift I'm so excited that we have artificial intelligence that can read handwriting. So finally, remember this little quote by Thomas Edison. He said, "Many of life's failures are people who did not realize how close they were to success when they gave up." Don't give up, just keep trying. And my final tip is the most important. Pray for guidance and help with your research. Listen to the Spirit. You will be surprised at the miracles that will come into your life, both big and small. I love this quote by Henry B. Eyring. He said, "After you find the first few generations, the road will become more difficult. You will be tempted to stop and leave the hard work of finding to others who are more expert or to another time in your life. But you will also feel a tug on your heart to go on in the work, hard as it will be. As you decide, remember that the names which will be so difficult to find are of real people to whom you owe your existence in this world and whom you will meet again in the spirit world. Their hearts are bound to you. Their hope is in your hands. You will have more than your own strength as you choose to labor on to find them. As you seek guidance in finding the information about your relatives, if those answers are available, you will find them. There have been times where it's taken me a long time to find the answers I'm looking for, but there have been many times where I've had little miracles, just a little thought in my head to try a different book or to look at a different record and find the answer I was looking for. I hope this gives you some ideas of things that you can do to find the answers to your questions on your family tree. And probably you have some other good ideas too, but don't just rely on those record hints. You need to really expand your searches, dig a little deeper, and let the Spirit guide you.